السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين والعاقبة للمتقين ولا عدوان إلا على الظالمين، والصلاة والسلام على سيد الأنبياء والمرسلين محمد وآله وصحبه أجمعين ومن تبعهم بإحسان إلى يوم الدين. أما بعد، اللهم انفعنا بما علمتنا وعلمنا ما ينفعنا وزدنا علما وفقها في الدين يا رب العالمين. Inshallah, as always, we'll quickly go through the recap of last week's session, inshallah, before we continue in today's session. So last week we discussed the Suez Canal crisis, or the war that took place. So we covered the background and the different issues or global issues, political issues that were in play at the time, from the Cold War, the Arab Cold War, or the internal strife, and the difference between Jordan and Egypt in the plan of Pan-Arabism to become the most senior Arab state. Then Arab nationalism that was within the populations of the states of the time, and the Arab-Israeli conflict. So these were all four factors which were all contributing towards and culminating in the events that took place. Then we discussed the different alliances that were there. So we discussed the CIA and the US meetings with Jamal Abdel Nasser and Egypt, as well as the UK ties that were breaking down with Egypt at the time, and the US wanting to stay neutral publicly in any case and in the actions that they took with regards to what happened. And then we discussed the ties between Israel and France and how they had strengthened in the most recent years before what took place, including the funding of weapons to Israel by France, and then Jamal Abdel Nasser playing with the USSR, trying to get weapons from there, playing off the US, taking money from them, making promises to both sides and then not really fulfilling either side's promises. And then the establishment of the United States of the Middle East Defense Organization as a response and to prevent Russian or Soviet influence in the Middle East. And then we discussed the revolt that was taking place in Algeria against the French and the Egyptian support for them, which then made France hate Egypt, ally with Israel, give them more weapons despite the agreements that had been there, accusing or basically equating Jamal Abdel Nasser to Hitler, his book to the Mein Kampf, calling him a Nazi threat, the biggest threat since World War II. And basically Israel and France had decided that they're going to attack Egypt, whatever happens, even if the UK says no. There was a tripartite agreement which was supposed to be between the Western nations that they will not, whatever they arm Israel, they'll do the same arming to the Arab states. They won't arm one more than the other. But France broke the agreement and Egypt got more weapons from USSR via Czechoslovakia. And then we have the nationalization of the Suez Canal, which was in July, on the 26th of July, 1956. So Jamal Abdel Nasser says UK control, French control of this company has been cancelled. Now the Egyptian government controls this company and owns this company. The employees can stay, but we will manage and take control. In response to that, eventually the Prime Minister of France, Israel, and the Foreign Minister of Britain, they get together, and in October 1956 they plan to attack Egypt. And the plan is that Israel will invade Gaza and the Sinai Desert. Britain and France will play the policeman, and then they will come and attack alongside Israel and attack Egypt to take over the Suez Canal. So Israel launches Operation Kadesh on the 29th of October. The next day Britain and France give the warning, and then the day after they come and start bombing on the 31st. Eventually, on the 7th of November, so in a few days, a ceasefire is called. By that time, Israel has basically taken a large part of the Sinai Desert. They've come all the way down south to Sharm el-Sheikh, and taken over Gaza and all of these areas. The ceasefire takes place on the 7th of November. There's UN resolution. Britain and France pull out. Israel refuses. Eventually, all the way in March, they then withdraw from the Sinai Desert and Gaza after they have got what they wanted, which was the opening of the Straits of Tehran, which is here, which goes to the only port that Israel has on this side. The rest of their ports are in the Mediterranean Sea. So this is the only port that comes through the Red Sea and through the Gulf, where Israel has access to, which at the moment is basically blocked, which you will have seen in the news. So at the moment, this port here, which goes through the Straits of Tehran, basically there's no ships in that port again. And this was an issue which they had then in 1956. So they got the agreement that those straits will be opened and Israel shipping will go through Suez Canal, won't be blocked, and will go through the Straits of Tehran. After those assurances, they then withdrew. And also the UN peacekeepers, they will come on in the Sinai Desert in Egypt and not inside the borders of the Israeli state. Anyway, carrying on from that, before we talk about the other things that were happening, let's just have a quick understanding of what was happening in terms of governance in Palestine. Obviously, the 1948, Britain withdraws, so the British mandate ends. Israel establishes or creates their state and declares their state. But what was happening about the Palestinians? And this is a question that was asked before as well. So I think now is a suitable time for us to discuss until this point of what's taking place. So in the war in 1948, once the war had gone on for a few months, eventually the Arab League, they got together and they said, we need to establish a government in Palestine. We need to establish a government in Palestine. So on the 22nd of September 1948, so a number of months in the third part of the war, if you remember, the war was split up into 3 different sections. We had the first, then we had a ceasefire, then we had the second war, which was only a few days, then a ceasefire, then a number of months, until eventually 1949, the war came to an end. So in September 1948, the Arab League got together and they all agreed that there should be a government for Palestine, and they called it the All-Palestine Protectorate. So this was what it was called, and this was supposed to represent all of Palestine. So the UN mandated Palestine basically, but at that time, which was physically the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. Although it wasn't known as West Bank at that point in time. It wasn't known as West Bank then. So it was Palestine, so Jerusalem, the old city, this whole area, and Gaza and the Gaza Strip. However, Jordan, who was obviously part of the Arab League, they refused. They refused to acknowledge the All-Palestine Protectorate. So basically, because Jordan had come into what we know as the West Bank, and all the way until East Jerusalem, therefore the All-Palestine Protectorate was only left in the Gaza Strip. That's it. There was nowhere else where it had effective control or anything at all. The Prime Minister who was allocated for this government, his name was Ahmed Hilmi Pasha. And Ahmed Hilmi Pasha, he was a general in the Ottoman army. And then after he was born in Lebanon, and after the dissolvement of the Uthmani Khilafah and the Ottoman rule, he then had a number of roles in Jordan, in Iraq, and then after he had a role as part of the treasury in Palestine, British Mandate of Palestine. He then was one of the first who was working in the Arab Bank. He established his own bank. He was working in finance for a while until eventually, after a number of positions that he held in the Arab world, and mainly in Palestine, and he was the one in Palestine at that time, he was appointed as Prime Minister. The President was, if you remember, the Mufti Muhammad Amin al-Husseini, who we discussed before, who was in Palestine, appointed by the British as the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem. Then he turned against the British, and then eventually he went in exile to Iraq and thereafter Germany. Then he came back to Egypt. So he was appointed the President of the All-Palestine Protectorate. So this was in 1948. But in terms of how effective this was, in reality, it had no executive role in terms of implementation of any kind of law on the ground. They continued with the laws of the British Mandate that had been put in place by the British. There was no really any change in terms of that. It was backed up and protected by the Egyptians, who had been appointed as the guarantors by the Arab League. So the name of the government was mainly political and symbolic. In fact, during the war, at one point, if you remember, in the third part of the war, the Israeli forces, they took over the Gaza Strip in 1948. So when they took over the Gaza Strip, the leadership, they all relocated back to Cairo, and then they never went back to Gaza Strip. So they were effectively a government in exile. So they never really had any real impact in terms of ruling in Gaza. So it was called the All Palestine Protectorate. But then in 1958, 1959, it basically dissolved, and it was taken over direct Egyptian rule all the way until 1967, which was the 6-day war, which we'll discuss today. So it was came under an umbrella country or an umbrella organization, which was called the United Arab Republic. So the United Arab Republic was, so if you remember Pan-Arabism, where Jamal Abdel Nasser wanted to get all the Arab countries together under one rule. So obviously he didn't have agreement from the Hashemite kingdoms of Iraq and Jordan, but he had a good relationship with Syria for a while. So what he did was he made an agreement with Syria, and they joined together in 1958 and made one state. Obviously the borders are not touching, but they basically came together as under one government in 1958, and they called it the United Arab Republic. And the United Arab Republic stayed in existence all the way until 1971. The name. So in 1958, end of 1958, 1959, the All Palestine Protectorate, this government just basically dissolved into the United Arab Republic. After that, the Gaza Strip was administered by the Egyptian military. So it was formally administered by the Egyptian military. They were looking after the Gaza Strip all the way until 1967, from 1959. So we have the All Palestine Protectorate from 48 to 59. So just about 10 years. But they don't really have effective control in Gaza Strip in that sense. Then from 1959 until 1967, you have Egyptian military administration of the Gaza Strip. The United Arab Republic, it was an agreement between Egypt and Syria in 1958, but Syria, they had a military coup and revolution, and they split from the United Arab Republic in 1961. So basically there was only Egypt left, and they were controlling the Gaza Strip, but they kept the name United Arab Republic, and it wasn't called Egypt until 1971. Then in 1971 they renamed it Egypt. Okay? So for those years there was no country named Egypt, technically. Now that was the Gaza Strip. So what about what is known as the West Bank? So in response to the September announcement of the Arab League of the All Palestine Protectorate, what Jordan did was they in December 1948 they held a conference in Jericho, and King Abdullah I of Jordan, he was known as the king of the Palestinian Arab lands, and he annexed basically the whole area from East Jerusalem and the whole as the West Bank to Transjordan. A year later, he got rid of the name of Palestine and Transjordan and called the whole thing the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan. So that's where the Kingdom of Jordan comes in a year later. And what he did, when he did that, he gave all of the people, all of the Palestinians, hundreds and thousands of them, almost 1 million Palestinians who were within that area, by him announcing the kingdom, he gave all of them the right to Jordanian citizenship. And from the details that came out years later, etc., it was understood that the Jordanians had an agreement with Israel that they will split Jerusalem, East Jerusalem, West Jerusalem. That's why in the 1948 war, when Israel went all the way into the Sinai Desert and took over Gaza Strip and was very active on the front with Egypt and even Lebanon and Syria, but they weren't very active in taking over the areas that were controlled by Jordan. And we've covered this before. So King Abdullah the First, he was on his way to have a meeting with the chief of Mossad and another intelligence officer of the Israeli government in July 1951. In July 1951. So just a couple of years after they've taken full control of the West Bank. Now what they did before that, in 1949, 1950, was that the area to the east, so in Jordan, of the Jordan River, they call that the Dhiffa Sharqiyya. They call that the east bank, the eastern bank of the river. And we covered this in the map. And then they named what we now know as the West Bank, they call that Dhiffa Al-Gharbiyya, the West Bank. So basically this is Jordan, and these are areas of Jordan. The East Bank, the West Bank, and then other areas that are inside Jordan. So these names were given in 1950. The Dhif al-Gharbi and these areas, they weren't known as that before 1950. These were official areas that came into being at that time under the rule of Jordan. Anyway, so King Abdullah goes and he's planned a meeting with the head of Mossad and etc. So he goes on Friday, on Jumu'ah, on the 20th of July, and he performs Jumu'ah Salah. He goes to perform Jumu'ah in Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa. But when he goes there, he is shot in his head, in his chest, and he's assassinated by a Palestinian at the door of Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa. He is assassinated, and King Hussein, he's the grandson of King Abdullah. He is injured. Well, actually, he wasn't injured. He was a young child, and a bullet deflected away from him. So he was okay, but he was with his grandfather at the time. He was succeeded. King Abdullah the First was succeeded by his son Talal, and however, Talal only stayed in power for about a year. He was then deposed from the throne by the parliament in Jordan, in the Kingdom of Jordan, on the pretext that he basically was mentally ill and incapable of leading the country. Thereafter, they run it for about a few months until Hussein turns in late 16, almost 17 years old. Then Hussein becomes a king of Jordan at the age of 17. And then he stayed for almost 40 years or longer as the king of Jordan. So this was what was taking place at that time. Now, if we look at the reports that come out, basically there was an issue that the British had and the Americans had with Talal, in that Talal was anti-British, and that for them posed a problem because the King Abdullah and thereafter King Hussein were both propped up by the US government and by the British and the agreements which we already mentioned before. But if Talal was anti-British and he was to come into power, that would then cause a problem for British interests in the region. So the British, let's say, man of influence who was living in Jordan at the time, British resident of Jordan, who basically was controlling the decisions of the Jordanian government, in that sense, influencing the decisions in any case, there was a discussion that should they put Talal or his brother Naif in charge of the government. And Talal was the eldest son, so by default he should be the king. There was a discussion that no, let's put Naif in charge and not let Talal become the next king. But the British said no, leave Talal and let him come into power, because if you were to put Naif into power, then the people will all rise up against the government, because they'll know that the British have put him in. It's direct British involvement. So let Talal come in. But before that, he sentenced, before Talal comes into power, he sentences Talal to the British, sentences Talal to a mental health institution. So before he comes into power, the British have already put an image in the people, in the Jordanian people's mind, and especially the elite, that he's mentally ill. So when he comes into power, within a year, the Supreme Council or whatever declares him to be mentally unfit, removes him from power, and brings the grandson, who is primed to be trained on the and influenced completely by the West and the British and US forces, and so they bring Hussein into power. And so he is basically in charge of the West Bank. He's the king of the West Bank. And this leads us on to what takes place in 1967. So we have the sixth, which is known as the 6-Day War. Israel have a few other names for it. The Arabs have a name for it, so sometimes it's called the 1967 war, sometimes it's called An-Nasfa. So you had An-Nakba, which was a catastrophe, so this is sometimes named by the Arabs as An-Nasfa, which was to be taken as the same as, or on the same like a rhyme of An-Nakba, and following on from what took place then. Again, the impact that had on the Palestinians and the Arab populations living in those areas. So the war took place, it was 6 days, so 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th and 10th of June 1967. Let's just go through a bit of the background that took place. First is that there were tensions building within the area. And you remember, even though the war has stopped, there are still Palestinian groups, which we have mentioned, who are coming cross-border from Jordan, from Egypt, doing small attacks here and there, incursions. The Israeli army continues to retaliate, etc., continues to provoke. Like, for example, in Syria, in the Golan Heights on the borders with Syria, they'd send an Israeli tractor to go in and start plowing the fields. And to try and instigate something to take place. So the tractor would go in. If the border guards didn't fire to try and disperse the tractor, then they tell the tractor driver to go even further, until eventually the border guards are agitated enough that they start shooting. Once they start shooting to tell the tractor to go back, then they come in with force and start attacking Syrian positions and Syrian villages who are by the border, accusing them of attacking the Israelis. And this was the same thing that they were doing in different areas. So there's all of this back and forth, etc. A few Israelis are maybe injured, maybe a few are killed. They then come back with force, destroy a village, destroy a few villages, drive some Palestinians out of their homes, then come back. And this continued. Now remember, we have the United Nations emergency force that was there after the war in the Sinai Desert in Egypt. They're supposed to protect the border between Egypt and Israel. So they are there. In November 1966, as a consequence of what's taking place and etc., Syria and Egypt, they sign a defense agreement. So if anyone attacks Syria, Egypt will step in to defend. Anyone attacks Egypt, Syria will step in to defend. And the main reason was the state of Israel. And IDF kept, as we said, attacking here and there, and excursions across the borders, sometimes coming into Syria, sometimes going into Jordanian-held areas, etc. And then we have what we mentioned before already, the Straits of Tiran on the map, that goes to the only port of Israel in the east. So in May 1967, as a consequence of what's taken place before that, what Egypt does is they put up their defense lines in the Sinai Desert. They feared an attack from Israel, and so they told the UN forces that you're not going to be able to stop Israel when they attack. So they told them to move away from the border, and then Israel sent a few tens of thousands of their troops to go on the border of Israel to make sure to protect that border, which had been attacked in the Suez Canal crisis. And Israel had basically come and entered into majority of the Sinai Desert. So to protect Israel from coming in, so the central and southern parts of the Sinai Desert, they focus their forces on those borders so that Israel doesn't do a surprise attack. and they expelled the UNE force from the borders. And then on the 22nd of May, they closed the Straits of Tiran to Egyptian shipping. So 22nd, 23rd of May, now Egyptian ships are banned from going through. Israeli ships are banned from going through the Straits of Tiran from that side. So Israel says that's basically, for us, that's a declaration of war. That's what they regarded it as. Anyway, Egypt's plan was not to attack Israel, and this is something which is in contradiction to some of the narratives that are stated by pro-Israeli historians and Israeli ministers that in 1967, on the 5th of June, 220 million Arabs attacked Israel. It was that was definitely not the case, as we will see. Even Egypt itself, and if you look at the comments of the Egyptian ministers of the time, and including the Prime Minister and others, they were all 100% sure that that Egypt is not going to, or is not planning to attack Israel at all. Egypt has just massed a few troops on the border as a defense mechanism, just in case they are attacked. And this was a consensus almost basically in the Israeli circles. None of them believed that Egypt was going to attack them. And same thing in terms of the other fronts, so Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon. There was no idea that there was going to be an attack from that side at all anyway. So this was a false notion that they were attacked by all of these Arab states in 1967. Egypt's plan was just to put up defense lines and protect their borders. What happened before that, which was in November 1966, a group of Palestinian resistance fighters, they had put a mine under one of the roads that the Israeli patrols went through, and the Israeli patrol went through that road, and the vehicle went over the mine. The mine exploded. 3 Israeli troops were killed and 6 were injured. Okay, so there's 3 are injured, 3 are killed, and 6 are injured. In retaliation to this incident, number one, Jordan, the king of Jordan, sends a letter of apology and condolence to the Israelis through the US embassy. However, it's Saturday, or for whatever reason, the US delays a few days. The US ambassador delays a few days in sending it over to the Israeli ministers. There is a conversation that takes place between, or messages sent between both countries. Jordan has been arresting the Palestinian resistance fighters, as we mentioned already, for years. And Israel says that you can't let these people come over the border. Jordan says we're not looking for a war. We will do an investigation and arrest whoever's responsible. Israel, however, what they do is the Israeli Defense Force or the Israeli military, they plan an attack in response to 3 of their soldiers getting killed. What do? They amass 3,000 to 4,000 troops, and they then announce an operation called Operation Shredder, and they go into As-Safwah village, which is under Jordanian control in the West Bank, and surrounding villages, and they attack those villages. They drive out Palestinians from their homes, and then specifically in this village, in As-Safwah village, they remove all of these Palestinians from the homes. So they tell all the Palestinians to come out their homes and come into the central location, the square in the center of the town. So all of them come out their homes. They gather in the center of the town. They then get 125 homes and destroy them. They just blow them up. And in addition to that, they blow up a medical clinic, a school, they damage a masjid, and dozens of other homes as well are damaged. So they just come. You may see images that similar in the last few weeks, for example, where suddenly they just rig explosives in like a couple of days ago, or yesterday, they just rigged explosives in approximately 56 homes or more, and just basically wiped out the whole area, all the residential buildings in that area. They just blew them up. So they did the same thing. They wiped out 125 homes, clinic, medical clinic, school, etc. And so, as a result of this, they also ended up there being a defense pact between Jordan and Egypt. So now there's a 3-country pact. Jordan, and allied with Jordan is Iraq. So Iraq then enter into the pact. But it's mainly Jordan, Egypt, and Syria. So you have the Egyptian-Syrian pact, which we said was in November 1966, and then on the 30th of May we have the pact between Jordan and Egypt, and this came about because of such attacks by Israel. And Jordan, the king of Jordan, faced a massive backlash because of what took place, and Israel entering into this area that was controlled by them. In fact, the US ministers of the time, they said that Israel has put all of our efforts into jeopardy. We've been working with both the Jordanians and the Israelis, and there have been agreements from before. We're keeping everything, cool and calm. In fact, Jordan was one of the first countries to recognize Israel, the state of Israel, come to an agreement and peace treaty with Israel later on. But even at that time, as we said, there were meetings taking place between Jordan and Israel. And the US minister said they have almost put the $500 million that we have spent on King Hussein into jeopardy by carrying out this attack. So even the US were not very happy with what happened. In fact, this was one of the rare cases where the US, Britain, France, and the USSR, all of them agreed in a UN resolution to condemn Israel for this attack which they carried out. But Israel didn't really care, although internally they had a bit of a discussion, should we do so or not. However, it was generally seen that if they were to attack Jordan, there wouldn't be as much of a consequence. They wanted to teach them a lesson, as they said, their right to self-defense against their 3 soldiers who were killed. But if they were to attack Jordan, there wouldn't be much of a repercussion on Israel militarily, even though generally they suspected that most of the attacks on Israeli territory were coming from Syria, not from Jordan anyway. That most of the people were always crossing from Syria, and but they did not want to attack Syria, because at that time Syria had relations with the USSR and with Soviet Russia and with Egypt. And any attack in Syria, and that may bring not only Egypt into the war, but it might bring the Soviet Russia into the war, and that is not something which they wanted to deal with. Anyway, so Jordan and Egypt then signed a defense pact on the 30th of May. Now the Straits of Tehran are blocked. On the 4th of June, the Israeli war cabinet convenes, and they then agree to go to war against Egypt. They call it Operation Focus. And on the next morning, on the 5th of June, at 7:45, they attack Egypt. So if we go through the events that take place, there was no attack by Egypt or any other country on Israel. At 7:45 a.m. Local time, Israeli Air Force, the Israeli Air Force was estimated at that time between 200 to 300 fighter jets, mainly French, and then the rest of the military was UK, US, and French. So the Israeli fighter jets, nearly all of the Air Force, so 188 fighter jets, and they've been training for a while to carry out an attack. So what they have done is they have built up training strips inside their own territory, mock areas of Egypt, which they will attack and bomb. All the plans have been put in place from long before. So as soon as the command is given, the pilots know where to go. And generally, the bombing sorties, what would happen is that a fighter pilot, what he would do is he would bomb in a day. The plane would bomb once or twice. Yeah, so there will be 2 sorties by each plane a day, maximum. What they did was they trained in order to make the Air Force work much quicker. So they doubled the amount of bombs that they can drop in one day. So each plane, instead of bombing twice maximum in a day, would be bombing 4 times in a day. Yeah? So this was their plan. They'll go bomb, come back, refuel, bomb, come back. reload. So instead of bombing maximum twice, they will be bombing 4 times each plane. So imagine you have approximately 200 planes. So instead of bombing 400 times, unloading their ammo, they will be unloading their ammo 800 times, which is double the amount of firepower. And double the amount of maximum firepower that was previous, as compared to all of the Arab states. So the Arab states would have 1 to 2 sorties a day before this starts. But what they did was they trained before this happened, and then they basically, almost the whole Air Force, according to some reports, only 8 Israeli Air Force planes remain on the ground. All other planes went into the air and went straight to all of the Egyptian air grounds and bombed the runways, destroyed their planes, etc. And according to most reports, majority of the Egyptian Air Force was basically wiped out within a few hours. On that first day, the Egyptian Air Force was basically wiped out. A few planes, etc. remained, but during the rest of the war, there wasn't much. There was a bit, but not much Egyptian air activity. And the war was only 6 days. So the next 1 or 2 days, there was a little bit of Egyptian activity, but not much. So it was basically destroyed. They did the same thing when they attacked Jordan. In fact, they went and destroyed basically the whole of the Jordanian Air Force. They went all the way to Iraq, bombed airfields in Iraq, and bombed the airfields in Syria. Basically wiped out all of the Arab states' air forces. There was one man who became famous because approximately out of all of their jets, I think about 13 Israeli jets were destroyed according to the reports, as compared to hundreds of jets across the Arab states. So one man became famous. His name was Saiful Azam, and he was a Pakistani Air Force pilot. And he was sent as an advisor and a trainer to the Jordanian Air Force. And he also worked in assisting the Air Force in Iraq, obviously the ties between Jordan and Iraq. And so he was present there at that time of the war in 1967. And so he is credited to have shot down in 2 separate flights. In one flight, he shot down one IAF plane, and in the second flight, in one flight, he shot down 2 Israeli bombers. So he's known, he received an honor in Jordan and in Iraq and the other Arab countries, and then he got the honor when he went back to Pakistan. He became famous for giving Israel the highest number of Air Force airplane casualties in its history. So he was someone who became famous during this war. But anyway, apart from this individual, there wasn't really much Air Force impact against the Israeli Air Force and their fighter jets and their bombers. In terms of the forces that they had on both sides, so Israel had 264,000 troops, including their reservists at that point in time. Obviously now the number is much higher. The number is upwards of 600,000 currently, of which they've called up the number of forces at the moment is about 450,000, 60,000. But anyway, so they had 264,000 including reservists. And these were all trained, and they were prepared to go to war with the Arab states. The other states, on the other hand, so the Arab states, Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Iraq, they weren't really prepared for war in that sense. Their forces were about 250,000. About 250,000 if you add all of those states together. Like Egypt, despite it being such a large country, they only had about 100,000 troops. They didn't have more than that. And as well as the other countries that were there, maybe 75,000 troops. Jordan, 45,000 from Syria. So the numbers were not very large. And they had their internal issues and conflicts, which I already discussed. Syria had gone through multiple military coups within a short period of time, the alliance with Egypt, the United Arab Republic, then another coup that took place, and another coup that took place. So the military in there was very weak and disfigured, fragmented, etc. So militarily they didn't really have as organized force as the Israeli military force that was united under one command and trained for battle. Although the Egyptian troops had served in Yemen and other places. Anyway, so on the first day, the main front on the attack on the 5th of June was the Sinai Desert. So 7:45, the Air Force, the Israeli Air Force, starts bombing all of the airfields, the military airfields in the Sinai Desert, the Egyptian airfields. At the same time, so 5 minutes later, 7:50, the ground troops start heading into Israel. And this heading into Egypt, sorry, in the Sinai Desert. And what they have planned is to do the opposite of what they have done previously. So the main routes and the routes which the Egyptians had expected that a possible attack may come was similar to the Suez Canal crisis. Central and southern Sinai Desert. But what they did this time was they came through central as a second point, and the main point was in the north. So they entered from Rafah city. They took over Rafah and Khan Yunis. That's where they started from. So they entered Khan Yunis. Many Palestinians and others were killed in Khan Yunis and Rafah. And then from there they went into the Sinai Desert. They entered straight into Egypt. And their plan was to do like a thin column and enter straight deep as far as they could go, as quick as they could go, without shooting until they were right upon the Egyptian forces, and then basically take them by surprise. And so that is what they did. So very quickly they advanced into the Sinai Desert. And they entered into all of these places. The initial command was that do not enter into the whole of the Gaza Strip. That was the initial command. So they entered into Khan Yunis and Rafah. For the rest of the Gaza, they left it. They entered mainly into the Sinai Desert, and they pushed back the Egyptian forces. And this basically would make the Gaza Strip secluded, cut off from any kinds of reinforcements from Egypt or anything. The main forces are in Egypt. So Gaza won't be much of a place that would need such a strong military offensive. So they pushed back the Egyptian forces. In one day they pushed them back quite far. Day 6 they have entered into large parts of the Sinai Desert. On the second day they enter into the Gaza Strip. So shots are fired at the Israelis, the Palestinians in Gaza. They start to defend themselves against this attack, and so Israel brings in forces. But the fight that was taking place in Gaza was much more fierce than a lot of the battles, or majority of the battles that they faced in the Sinai Desert. So it took a couple of days for them to take over the parts of Gaza, even though Gaza is obviously small compared to the Sinai Desert. Anyway, eventually they go through on the first day until the town of Al-Arish. Al-Arish is then surrounded. They then enter Al-Arish on the next day, and they continue going through. Eventually the Egyptian forces, as they are collapsing, the order to retreat is given. And they start retreating on the 7th of June. And so they start retreating. The Israeli military forces, they come all the way until Sharm el-Sheikh. Sharm el-Sheikh is bombed. That's the entry point of the Straits of Tiran. But even from there, the Egyptian troops eventually withdraw. And as they're withdrawing, the battalions, the Israeli military battalions, they start chasing the troops. Then they realize that actually they're all withdrawing. So rather than chasing them, let's set up some ambushes. So the battalions, including one of the battalions led by Ariel Sharon, they then make ambushes on paths which the Egyptian army will pass through in the retreat back out of the Sinai Desert. The command has been given for them to completely withdraw. So they wait for the Egyptian army to come here. Many of them in panic, they left some of their weapons, they left vehicles, and they just in panic rushing back out of the Sinai Desert. They wait there for the forces to come into these valleys where they have set up the ambushes. And according to some reports, in one valley, maybe 1,200 Egyptian soldiers are just killed in one go. Many of them are basically have to walk back on foot for 200 kilometers all the way back to the Suez Canal. Many of them die of hunger and thirst on the way, of heat stroke. And anyway, there was a huge attacks against the forces while they were retreating. By the 7th, they've taken over the entire Sinai Desert. They've taken over the entire Sinai Desert. Egyptian forces have completely withdrawn, and basically Gaza, this Gaza Strip, and the Sinai Desert is under total Israeli control. On the other side, we have the West Bank. Obviously, there's now an agreement between Jordan and Egypt, and also Syria and Egypt, in terms of defense. So once the attack takes place, because the attack is so wide and so harsh, and although it didn't really start as much in the West Bank, the Israeli troops were slowly just coming in, doing a few raids in the morning of the first day. The Jordanian troops, once they saw that Egypt had been attacked, they thought there was going to be a general attack on all of these states. So they start shelling the Israeli army positions, and then the shelling increases. They then have a meeting. Moshe Dashan, the Israeli military commander, we've discussed him before. He was the commander again in this war, and he eventually gives the command to go and attack the Jordanian troops in the West Bank. And so they attack the Jordanian troops. Again, they use the same method. Once the planes come back from Egypt from their bombing sorties, they tell them to straight go and start attacking the Jordanian airfields and the Iraqi airfields. They're all bombed on the first day. On the first day, straight away, they bomb all of them until basically the Jordanian Air Force is out of function, as well as the Iraqi Air Force, apart from a few Israeli planes that were shot down, one by ground defense, a couple were shot down, etc., like we mentioned. But apart from that, the air forces of both Iraq and Jordan are also wiped out. So the battle carries on the ground. Again, within a couple of days, so towards the latter part of the 5th, when the battle in the West Bank and the East basically gets into full flow, and on the 6th, the battle reaches its peak. On the 7th, the Jordanian troops start to withdraw. They start to withdraw from the West Bank. They go to the east of the Jordan River, and King Hussein and the military leaders, they call a total withdrawal of all Jordanian troops. There are few remaining inside the old city of Jerusalem. And there are some Palestinian resistance groups in different areas, in Nablus, in Jenin, in a few places. There are still Palestinian resistance groups embedded there. So the Israeli army goes. Initially, according to the reports, they hadn't planned to enter the old city because of international condemnation or whatever. And obviously there's Bethlehem or Beit Lahem, which is where the Christians are based, and they don't want to cause an outcry by the Christian community. But then on the 7th, when they see the Jordanian forces are withdrawing and the UN resolution comes, they put everything aside and they enter even into the old city. Fights take place in the narrow streets, because obviously the streets there are very narrow, for those of you who've been there. So the old cities, if you look at a lot of these countries around there, so old city in Damascus, Dimashq, and all of these areas, the cities are very narrow streets. So they go inside all of these streets and they fight street to street with the Jordanian forces and the Palestinian resistance forces until they drive all of them out as well on the 7th of June. And they take over the whole of the West Bank on the 7th of June, including the old city of Jerusalem. And the pictures, and you can find pictures from there online of the Israeli military officers and commanders inside the streets of Jerusalem, by the Western Wall, etc. And then, so that's Jordan and Iraq, that's Egypt. What about Syria? These are the main 4 countries. I think Saudi Arabia had sent a few tanks and a few things, but they didn't really get involved in the war, as well as Lebanon didn't really get involved. They sent a few units. There were some African countries from North Africa, so Libya sent a few, and a couple of other countries sent a few, but nothing really significant in the grand scheme of things. So in terms of Syria, so again on the first day they didn't really enter the war. but there was provocations by the Israeli military against that had been continuing against Syria. And the Syrians, even though they had that defense agreement, but their army wasn't really up for anything because of what had been happened, like I mentioned, the military coups and internal military coups. So this military commander goes against this military commander, and so the military is basically in pieces. So on the 9th of June, the Israeli military eventually decides, you know what, we've taken all of these areas, we might as well go and take over the Golan Heights. And as the name suggests, the Golan Heights are a higher position. So the Syrian troops are basically on a high position overlooking what are the areas of Israel. So militarily and strategically, that's a risk and a disadvantage to the Israeli military, because the Syrian military is overlooking them at a much higher point. It's also more difficult to conquer, more difficult to take over. But they decide that no, let's go and take over. So Moshe Dashan again, he gives the order, and the troops go through. There's a intense battle that takes place. It's a narrow path that they need to navigate through minefields. But a few of the battalions, they get to the top on the first day. Then the second day, eventually, majority of the battalions get to the top with thousands of reinforcements. They take over the Golan Heights and they push back the Syrian army, who withdraws and calls a withdrawal, and the Syrian army also withdraws from the Golan Heights. So now they've taken over the whole of the West Bank. They've taken over the Sinai Desert as well as the Gaza Strip, and they've taken over the Golan Heights, which technically are or legally are part of Syria. And so now all of these areas are occupied by the 10th of June. So within 6 days, they've taken over all of these areas. A ceasefire was agreed to by Egypt and Jordan once they had ordered their withdrawal. Egypt and Jordan, they agreed to a ceasefire with Israel on the 8th of June. On the 8th of June, so within a few days. Syria, once they were attacked on the 9th of June, and the first Israeli forces reached the Golan Heights and started pushing the Syrian and broke the first line of defense, and Syrian troops had started to withdraw. They agreed to a ceasefire on the 9th, even before they had been completely pushed back from the Golan Heights, and eventually a peace agreement was signed between all of these countries and Israel on the 11th, so the day after the end of the war. And the war ended because Israel basically won. They took over all of these areas. So this was in terms of the military events that took place. A very significant event that took place during this war was on the 4th day of this war, which we will discuss. But first, let's just go through the casualties that took place and the death toll. So in terms of how many soldiers or how many individuals from each side were killed, the casualties in terms of the Arab states are 13,300 upwards. So that's the middle figure. According to some reports, even more than that. According to some reports, just the Egyptian number of casualties was 13,000. But again, there's different reports, but approximately 13,300 upwards Arabs were killed in this conflict, with obviously thousands more injured. Israelis, 779 Israelis were killed. So you can see the massive difference in terms of the numbers. And if you look at the fronts, for example, on the Egyptian front, we have 338 Israeli troops killed as opposed to 12,000 Egyptians. Massive difference. On the other front, so we had Jordan and Syria. On the Jordanian front, we have 300 Israeli troops or Israelis as compared to 800 Jordanians. On the Syrian side, we have 141 Israelis as compared to 500 Syrians. So the numbers of casualties there was a huge disparity in terms of the numbers. And in terms of the prisoners, also, many Egyptians were taken prisoner. Because when the Israelis laid ambush, so many of them, they basically gave themselves up and let themselves be taken prisoner. It came to the extent that Israel said, we don't have the capacity to take any more prisoners. What they would do is they would take the higher ranking military officers as prisoner so that they could exchange them for Israeli Air Force pilots, the few who had been captured because their planes had crashed, etc. And the rest of like the low-level troops, they just told them, go that way is the Suez Canal, go back to Egypt. We don't have the capacity to take you as prisoner. So they took over 6,000 prisoners. Israel took over 6,000 prisoners, whereas 15 Israelis were captured. Yeah, and again, like in the 1948 war, where you had approximately 750,000 plus Palestinians were displaced as a result of this war, you had over 418,000 Palestinians who were displaced. So altogether, we're talking about 1.25 million Palestinians over both these wars who have been displaced from their homes. And that's disregarding the continuous encroachment of the Israeli army and the settlers on villages every so often, continuously driving them away from their homes, continuous pressure, etc., removing villages in the years in between these wars, and what follows later on. So we have over 1.25 million of Palestinians who are now displaced. So the number of displaced Palestinians just keeps on increasing, and not in like a few hundred, no. In one go, 418,000. Before that, 750,000. So the mass displacement as a result of this war also. Now we'll come to the significant event that took place after we look at this map. So if you look at the map, the blue that we can see, this is what was the Israeli state before this war. So this was all controlled by the Israeli government before the 5th of June. After that, if we look at the light green areas, the slightly darker green areas there, these areas were taken by Israel on the first day of the war. So they entered on the first day of the war. And then as the days went through, they took over what's like this sort of yellowish areas. This was on the second day. And then by the third and fourth day, they had taken over all of these light green areas. And then finally, if you look at the north in Syria, they're really light green. Those are the Golden Heights which they took on the final days of the war. So within a few days, as you can see, they took over large areas. So they took over basically an area which is the size of Israel itself, the whole of the Sinai Desert. And they took over all of 1 million Palestinians who are living inside the West Bank, as well as the Palestinians who are living inside Gaza, and many thousands of Palestinians. And there are still images in the archives of Palestinians throwing pieces of wood onto the Jordan River, women and children carrying a few items which they can, crossing over the border into Jordan to protect themselves and save themselves from the onslaught of the Israeli military that was entering into every single village and town. So the incident that took place, which was significant, was the attack on the US ship, the USS Liberty. So the USS Liberty was in international waters, about 25 kilometers north of the Sinai Desert. Okay, so it's in the Mediterranean Sea, 25 kilometers north of the Sinai Desert. And it's flying a large American flag. It's an American ship. And the US obviously is an ally of Israel. At 8 a.m. On the 8th of June, so a few days into the war, the Israeli military jets, they fly over the US ship, the American ship. They fly over so they can see the ship. So they've seen the ship, they know that the ship is there. They then fly back to land. Then in the afternoon, at exactly 2 o'clock, Israeli military jets, they come flying at speed, low, and they come and fly sorties over the USS Liberty, and they bomb the US ship. They bomb the ship. And they bomb the ship until the ship is basically ablaze. They kill 8 American soldiers, over 100 are critically wounded. So 100 have really bad injuries. And the ship is ablaze. Within 24 minutes, so at 2:24, after the airstrikes take place, then you have 3 torpedo boats of the Israeli military. They come and they attack the burning ship, the burning American ship. They kill another 25 American soldiers. And then they fire the crewmen who are trying to put out the fires on board the ship that's been caused by the bombing and the attacks. So the ship is now attacked by machine gun fire. At quarter past three, a command is given that abandon ship. The ship is going to sink. Yeah, the ship we cannot survive on the ship. So everyone get on the life rafts and abandon ship. So the U.S. military service personnel, they jump onto these rafts to try and escape. The rafts are then attacked by the Israeli military, and the Israeli military sinks two of these U.S. Rafts that have and the soldiers that are on these rafts. So two of these rafts are then sunk, and the others are attacked. Rescue was called in, and so the information was given to another U.S. ship that was supposed to come and rescue them, the USS Saratoga. However, the rescue mission was aborted. And no ship came to rescue the USS Liberty or the American service personnel who were on the ship. And eventually, the ship is destroyed. And as a result of this attack, from a crew of 297, so the ship had a crew of 297. From a crew of 297, 34 US personnel are killed and 171 are injured, which is basically majority of the crew. What happened after this? There was no official investigation, neither by the US nor by Israel. Nothing came to being of this attack that took place. According to some reports, the USS Liberty, because it was so close to Egypt, it had a view of the minarets of Al-Arish. Now, if you remember, Al-Arish was surrounded and was reached by the Israeli military on the first day. And then they entered it on the second day, and the war took place in Al-Arish. There was fierce resistance, and for 2 days they faced, the battles took place in Al-Arish. So we're talking about the 6th and the 7th of June. And the USS Liberty was using the minarets of the mosque, of a masjid in Al-Arish as navigation. And so they could see what was happening in Al-Arish. So according to some of the historians, including Western historians, a reason for the attack, or possible reason for the attack, or what they have pointed out as the reason for the attack, is a cover-up to atrocities and massacres that were carried out by the Israeli army in Al-Arish, where they just massacred people. And because the USS Liberty and its crew were witnesses to what took place, therefore this ship was attacked so that they would not be able to provide any testimony to what took place in Al-Arish. So this has been suggested by, for example, James Bamford in Body of Secrets, and so this is the reason that is given. However, there were no implications and no consequences for Israel for this attack that they carried out on their own allies. In November 19th, obviously resolutions were passed during this war. Israel just ignored all of them. In November 1967, a US Security Council resolution was passed that Israel needs to withdraw from the areas that it has taken. It needs to withdraw from the Sinai Desert. It needs to withdraw from the West Bank. It needs to withdraw from the Gaza Strip. It needs to withdraw from the Golan Heights. But as was the habit of the Israeli government, they just refused to comply with the UN resolution. And so by the end of the war in 1967 and the years that followed, Israel had complete control over the whole of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip and areas of the Sinai Desert. Inshallah, next week we'll continue from what happened, the Yom Kippur War, which took place, and thereafter the re-entering of the removal of Israeli forces from the West Bank and what took place later on. Inshallah, we'll cover that next week. We ask that Allah Azza wa Jalla grants us the understanding of these events and how they lead up to what is taking place today, so that we can better understand the situation. We ask that Allah Azza wa Jalla again We ask Allah that He alleviates the suffering of our brothers and sisters in all of these blessed lands, from Gaza to Al-Quds, and all of the surrounding areas. We ask that Allah Azza wa Jal liberate Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa and grant peace and security and freedom and victory to our brothers and sisters in these areas. Ameen. Khair, if there are any questions pertaining to this or messages discussed today, inshallah, before we finish. Any questions?
So, was the blocking of the Strait of Tehran, is it?
Yes.
Was that the reason why Israel, is that their claim, is that the reason why they attacked?
That's their claim, that because our shipping route is blocked, we attacked Egypt. Well, on the first day of the war, Egypt was attacked. Egypt, obviously, they told internationally and they declared that they had been attacked by Israel. But at the same time, Israel claimed to the world that they had been attacked by Egypt. And so they claimed that they were doing it in retaliation to an Egyptian attack. But then eventually it came to know that there was no attack by Egypt. They also used the troops that Egypt had sent to the Sinai Desert to protect their borders as an excuse to say that Egypt is planning to attack, so therefore we have done a preemptive strike against Egypt. So they use these as excuses. Although they all agreed that Egypt wasn't planning to attack them, but they use that in terms of their publicity campaign.
There's this technical term that you use, this Latin phrase called causus belli or something. It's where it's like when they have a legal reason to attack. Even I think it's effectively means like preemptive.
It basically means preemptive strike. So it's a legal reason. If the country is going to attack you, you can attack them. So, any other questions?
What happened here? Did the US just sit there and
Yeah, they just sat there. They did. So when the USS Liberty was attacked, as you said, the USS Liberty was attacked. A ship was called in to assist, but they aborted the rescue mission. So there must have obviously been communication between the US and Israeli forces. There will have been communication and an understanding of what's taking place. And the US didn't throw its ally under the bus, despite everything else that was happening at the time. Obviously, they were unhappy. The US was unhappy because of what's happening with Jordan at that time, because Jordan was supposed to be their ally. In fact, when the war started, the US approached Jordan and told them, if I remember, the CIA director or one of their ministers spoke to Jordan and said, listen, don't enter the war. But King Hussein said, there's no way, we can't enter the war, because if I don't, then basically I'm going to lose my seat. The people of Jordan will just turn against me. And remember, we will have to remember that at this point, majority of the population of Jordan are Palestinians. There are more Palestinians than Jordanians. Yeah, so the Palestinians are not very happy with King Hussein in that sense. Generally, they obviously, a few of them, they assassinated his grandfather, King Abdullah, and they generally had a belief that, which was true, that there was agreements between the Israelis and the Jordanian rulers. So he feared that if obviously attacks by Egypt had been taking place, and he feared that if he did not enter into the war, he'd be toppled by his own people. So there would be no US ally left in the region from the Arab states at all. Then it would just be Israel. So he was forced to enter the war. So, I mean, the US interests, whatever they were, they did nothing to Israel, no repercussions, nothing with regards to what took place with the USS Liberty. Any other questions? No? Khair, inshallah. We ask that Allah Azza wa Jal gives a true understanding. Allah Azza wa Jal shows the truth, enable us to follow the truth, show us the batil, make it clear to us what is batil, and enable us to stay away from falsehood. Ameen. وآخر دعوانا الحمد لله رب العالمين. سبحان الله وبحمده سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك نشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت نستغفرك ونتوب إليك.